Okay, let's get back to the discussion. So just a quick go around again. Anybody like to just quickly unmute yourself or put in the chat your thoughts after reading the articles? I think we have kind of have I hope after reading the articles, you kind of have like a good idea of who are gatekeepers. So yeah, Prof. Tan, there are no gatekeepers per se in Singapore yet, but I think that's a good question to start thinking of whether there are gatekeepers in Singapore. Not that I know of, based on the EU's standard, which I'll go through in a bit. I don't think there are anyone kind of defined as a gatekeeper in Singapore yet. But who knows? We might have a different one if Singapore eventually decides to have a Digital Markets Act. So,
Lip Hang, can I just ask? It's
yeah?
also quite dangerous to predict who are the gatekeepers, right?
Exactly.
Because if they are listed in the stock exchange, you don't want to be the one to predict that also too, right?
Exactly. So the thing is, it's like a big target board. You'll be worried. Yeah, you will put out, and then it might be something that will make businesses, especially competitors, being very trigger happy, right, to just complain and say these gatekeepers are harming our business. Yeah. So yeah, but we'll go through that in the very last slide as we go start thinking through these issues from Singapore's lenses. So anyone else before I continue? Okay, now I'll continue with the discussion. So what is the market failure that the European Union is trying to treat here? So if you read the last sentence, by undermining competition and market contestability, the problems lead to inefficient market outcomes in terms of higher prices, lower quality, as well as less choice and innovation to the detriment of European consumers. So this reads and sound like textbook answers. Then you start asking yourself, when we look through, for example, what is being kind of designated as gatekeepers, Google, Facebook, and you think what terms of higher prices there are, where it's essentially free to use their services as a consumer. Okay, we'll layer this with the businesses points later. Does it then mean that the fact that they have grown to become such big networks simply because their very own success is what the EU is saying? This is because of your network effects, you're enjoying so many users on your network, you are causing less choice and innovation. Okay, so they say that the emergence of gatekeeper platforms have been accompanied by three main problems. One, weak contestability. So their view is once they grow very big, so in Andreas Schwab's term, they become a bottleneck. They're so big and they're bottleneck, you have to deal with them in order for you to operate effectively or efficiently in the digital sector. Number two, unfair business practices. So the European Union has gone after, the European Director General of Competition has gone after, for example, Google for abusing its dominance in the online search engine market, such that shopping platforms that compete with Google Shopping are unable to get a prominent shopping listing on the Google search website. So this is an example of what we call unfair business practice. Roman 3 here seems to be quite a interesting inclusion because it's technically unrelated to what the businesses, the digital businesses are doing. It's fragmented regulation and oversight. So this is more of a regulatory problem that the European Union was facing because they realized that there are several national rules across the EU member states that are emerging as a partial response to the problem, and there isn't a coordinated regulation oversight of the digital platforms. Okay, so the kind of the two causes or how the symptoms of market failure is undermining competition and market contestability. So the actions of this gatekeeper or the nature of their business, according to the EU DigiCom, leads to inefficient market outcomes. So what is then a core platform service? So it's any of the following. If you are called online intermediation service, your online search engine, a social network service, a video sharing platform service, interpersonal communication services, web browser, virtual assistant, cloud computing services, and online advertising services. So if you are a core platform service and you meet these three criteria, you will be considered a gatekeeper. So in EU's case, if you have a size that impacts the EU digital, the EU internal market. So it's either 7.5 billion in annual revenue size across the entire European Economic Area in each of the last 3 financial years, 75 billion in market cap or fair value in the last financial year. So this is either or to meet this criteria, and you operate in at least 3 EU member states. So first criteria checked. We move on to the second criteria. Whether you have a control of an important gateway for businesses towards final consumers. So there are 2 considerations here. One, 45 million monthly active users, MAU, in the last financial year, and 10,000 yearly active business user in the last financial year. So the last thing that you need to check that is whether you have an entrenched and durable position. So that means meeting criteria 1 and 2 in the last 3 financial years. So this is how a digital gatekeeper is defined. So what does the DMAU then mean? A DMA, mean for gatekeepers. So there are a few do's and don'ts. The examples of a do, right? So gatekeeper will have to allow third party to interoperate with their own services and to allow business user to access data that they generate in their use of the gatekeepers platform. So the theory is like what Andreas Schwab said earlier, right? These are bottlenecks. If the digital platforms have access to such data, and this data is so important, such that anyone in the market trying to enter or expand the market has access to such data, it becomes a bottleneck. So the market is not contestable. If the market is not contestable, we end up having, once again in the EU's term, higher prices, lower quality, less choice, and innovation. Gatekeepers also have to provide companies advertising on their platform with tools and information necessary for these advertisers to carry out their independent verification of their advertisements hosted by the gatekeeper. So these are allegations of unfair business practices that the EU DigiCom is considering. Well, the last thing is digital platform, gatekeeper platforms have to allow their business users to promote their offer and conclude contracts with their customers outside of the gatekeeper's platform. So you've heard earlier about the App Store, for example, right? They want apps to be available in all types of stores, not just the Apple App Store, but also maybe on the Google Play Store. So what are examples of the don'ts? What can gatekeeper platforms no longer do? 1, treat services and products offered by the gatekeeper itself more favorably. So this is what I discussed earlier. It sounds and reads like the Google online shopping case, which the EU DigiCom decided against. We also have that gatekeeper platforms cannot prevent consumers from linking up to businesses outside of their platforms. So this means that they can no longer create what we call a moat, so that other connecting or competing services can be offered. They also can no longer prevent users from uninstalling any pre-installed software or app if they wish to. And last, they are not allowed to track end users outside of their core platform service. So this seems to look without effective consent having been granted. So this seems to go back to the issue of data. So now that we've reached this point, right, you have a good idea of what Digital Markets Act is. We can start thinking about whether Singapore should follow the EU's lead. So the first question, right, what is the policy rationale here? We need to think about whether we have observed or do we even anticipate similar market failures in Singapore, given how small we are, how open our economy is. Is there a strong policy rationale for us to consider having something that looks like the Digital Markets Act? So this will mean looking carefully at whether smaller businesses are making complaints or are, I think there's another one in the meeting room. So whether smaller businesses are looking and complaining that they can't access the market because there are these big gatekeeper platforms, they are causing big bottlenecks, causing issues of market contestability. Well, the next thing is, can existing regulatory tools such as competition law, so in Singapore we have the Competition Act, can it deal with such market failures? Is it possible that we could use the existing tools to deal with these problems? Can we launch investigations, for example, right, and decide against certain conduct or agreements that these digital gatekeepers are engaging in? If the answer is yes, then do we need the Digital Market Act? So a related point, like I mentioned, like I discussed earlier, that the DMA will sit alongside the competition laws in Europe. So the question there is, how effective or useful is the DMA in achieving Singapore's policy objective, if we have one, to ensure, for example, market contestability? So as the old saying go, right, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So given that the DMA is ex ante in nature, how would it be operationalized? And how would it then be operationalized alongside competition laws? So this is a big question that I think no one has answers to. Would this be used, or would, for example, the EU DGCOM be happy to use ex ante regulation because it's fast, it's straightforward, compared to competition law investigation, which might take years, which might take much longer in order to achieve, to first establish the wrongdoing and then issue a direction to correct the wrongdoing? So how effective and useful is this? We don't really know yet, simply because the rubber hasn't hit the road yet. Or the last thing that we also need to think about is, are there unintended consequences? So like what Prof. Tan said earlier, right? What are the possible implications after you label someone as a digital gatekeeper? Or, for example, let's think about it hypothetically, right? If you come up with these details, these specific criteria, so what are businesses, then disincentivize from just hitting or just below the criteria, so they do not get embroiled with very tough ex ante regulation? Will that be a possible unintended consequence? We don't know too. We also need to wait and see what happens when the rubber hits the road. And if there are unintended consequences, how are they addressed? I think some of you here probably did a bit of behavioral economics. I think the most classic example of unintended consequences, it's bottle caps, right, for medicine. So because kids were opening up bottle caps and eating these prescription medicine, they made the bottle caps harder to close. So what did the adults do? Because it was harder to open. So what did the adults do? Because it was harder to open, they end up not closing the cap. So how do we address, or if there are unintended consequences like this, how then do we address such unintended consequences? So, and the last thing is, can we take a wait and see approach? What do I mean by that? Can we see how the European experience is and thereafter consider whether this is something that works for us. But more importantly, we need to first consider whether the platform operators, the gatekeeper per se in Singapore, if there is one or if there are they causing competition problems? Are they causing market failure outcomes? Are we observing such outcomes in the first place? So Prof has an interesting question. Do Grab platform cause bottleneck for cab booking services? So I think this is if I'm not wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the LTA currently prevents, there's regulations up there that prevents any booking service company for cab, for example, to require what we call exclusivity. So essentially, anyone can operate or should be allowed to operate across different booking platforms. So there are existing regulations. So now the next, on a related point then, should we then be thinking about, very sector-specific regulation instead of what we call a generic Digital Markets Act that looks like it applies to all sectors, right? All types of businesses. In this case, these type of businesses. Can we think about something that is more targeted if needed? And if we observe such market failures, do we then deal with these on a piecemeal basis? So for those who are hoping for an answer for me, I don't have a straight answer whether Singapore should follow the EU's lead. But I guess the closest answer that I can give, if you were to ask me for one, is we really need to take what we call a wait and see approach. I think as of now, if you see the enforcement actions that are taken in Singapore against gatekeepers, for example, or platform operators, for example, I think far and few between. I don't think we are seeing big market failures issues currently. And if we do, we then have to ask ourselves, right? Can the existing regulatory tools deal with such issues? And if we can, do we really need, or should we really introduce new regulatory tools? And how useful, right? Is this DMA in achieving this policy to ensure market contestability, to remove bottlenecks? Are we really certain that markets are unable to correct themselves because of these network effects? Well, what we're seeing here is probably, or what the European Union is kind of making decisions now, it's based on what they've observed probably in the last decade. Things might change extremely quickly, right? Well, we talked about Nokia earlier, our dumb phones versus smartphone, and that changed within 4 or 5 years. So is this a useful tool? I think it remains to be seen. Is this needed based on the European Union's argument? There's another layer of the argument here because they're concerned about what we call an internal market function because when they promote trade across the European Union. And there is that angle there that doesn't quite exist, if, for example, in Singapore's perspective, when we are thinking about introducing something similar. So with that, if there are no further questions, I think I can hand you back to the rest of to the organizing committee, and I think I've successfully ended this before an hour, so I don't stand between you and your weekend. Anyone has any questions? Having to take any questions now, if there is, or any comments? Okay, if there isn't, I will hand the time back to Jasmine and Professor Tan.
Thank you. Thank you.